On behalf of the UCL and SOAS Armenian Societies, I would like to thank you all for attending this event tonight. Tonight, we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Robert Fisk. This year, we have seen the 100th anniversary of the genocide pass with much international acclaim. Globally, we saw many governments acknowledging the genocide as a historical fact it is. We, at the UCL and SOAS Armenian Societies, have organised a variety of events throughout the year with the intent of raising awareness of the genocide and educating Armenians and non-Armenians, students and non-students. We look at the genocide from different lenses, whether this be the effect of the genocide on a family, as in our screening of grandma's tattoos, the precedent the genocide set for the Turkish Republic, as in our lecture with Vika and Cheterian, the legal implications of genocide in our hosting of Jeffrey Robertson, or with our research on Turks and Kurds who went out of their way to save Armenians from genocidal policies, as seen in our exhibition. We do this not just to accelerate the recognition of the Armenian genocide, but also to raise awareness of past injustices. It is only in educating ourselves of horrendous acts such as genocides and striving to achieve justice for them that we can hope to achieve a society free of such injustices. Tonight's event will be chaired by Racha Sobratee, President of the SOAS Armenian Society, and I now invite Rafi Sarkisyan to speak on behalf of AGCCC. Thank you.
Honourable friends, you're most welcome to this event, and on behalf of the Armenian Genocide Centenary Commemoration Committee, I would like to welcome you all. It's a great privilege to have Robert Fisk lecturing to us this evening. It's a unique opportunity in the sense of someone that has contributed immensely to publicizing the issue of the Armenian genocide, not only in the United Kingdom, but internationally, and someone that has taken the initiative in leading research, in contributing in every sense by writing very interesting articles, challenging articles, and by showing to the public that the Armenian genocide is not an issue that can be forgotten, and that there is justice to be done, and the contribution that has given us the inertia to drive the cause of the recognition. And as you know, over 24 countries have recognized the Armenian genocide through their parliamentary processes and decisions, and the development of how the Armenian genocide has become a political issue has now turned towards becoming a legal issue as well. So we hope that in the coming years, the concept of recognition and the issue of applying justice to this historical event will take more importance and priority on various forums, and hopefully at some point Turkey, and especially the government in Turkey, would also realize that it is to its benefit to recognize and acknowledge history rather than to continue denying it. What is important for all of us is the recent change in Turkey, a slight change on the government policy, and as you know, on Sunday during the elections, 3 Armenian MPs have been elected as well. But more importantly, the intellectual capacity of those in Turkey that are openly now discussing the Armenian genocide has made quite a significant impact, not only in Turkey but also outside. And gradually the pressure on the government is increasing. So therefore, through united efforts by intellectuals like Robert Fisk and people that campaign for recognition, we hope that we can achieve a proper and final settlement to this historical injustice. Thank you very much.
So tonight, we have the very rare honor of inviting a special guest, a very special guest. His name is Dr. Robert Fisk. Dr. Robert Fisk has studied at Lancaster University, and he later gained a PhD in political science from Trinity College, Dublin, in 1983. Since then, he has become an accomplished journalist. But what has he been writing on? Mr. Fisk has covered events in Portugal, in Lebanon, in Iran, Iraq, Bosnia, Algeria, Kosovo, and most recently in Syria. And Dr. Fisk has also done extensive research on the Armenian Genocide, where he first became acquainted with the topic doing research in Lebanon. His most recent article about the Armenian topic was entitled, "I dug the bones and skulls of massacred Armenians out of the Syrian desert with my own hands," in 1992. Dr. Fisk has received the British Press Awards International Journalist of the Year 7 times, and has twice won its Reporter of the Year award. With such a great wealth of knowledge and personal experience, this is what sets Dr. Fisk apart. And it's what allows me to say with great honour today, in front of everyone here, I introduce Dr. Robert Fisk to talk today.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me here. I'd like to introduce you to my new public relations. You know, when Racha Sobratee first called me up in Beirut and said, "Come and talk about 100 years after the Armenian Genocide," my first reaction was, "Yeah, sure, I'll come to London." And then I put the phone down and I said, "So what? I'm not the slightest bit interested in what you do 100 years after the Armenian Genocide. I want to know what the Armenians are going to do 100 years and 1 day after the Armenian Genocide. It's what happens from now onwards." A 100th anniversary is a totally artificial figure. History works through developments, not through clocks and calendars. And I felt that, in a sense, the 100th anniversary was a trap. It was a kind of closing of the door. Okay, we fought for 100 years, that's it. It's not. It's more essential, I think, for people to fight for the truth after the 100 years, when the clock shows that the last living witnesses are going or gone. I went to Istanbul on the 24th of April this year with my wife to watch brave, courageous Turks walk alongside Armenians to the prison where the genocide, let's call it by its real name, the Holocaust of the Armenians began. And we crossed the Bosphorus with Armenians and Turks and our brave and good friend, Ayhan Aktar, professor at the Turkish University, who's done more than most Turkish professors to expose the reality of the Armenian Holocaust to the Turkish people. And we went, of course, to the railway station where the first deportations left from for Anatolia. What was extraordinary, of course, was the fact that, with lack of deviousness, the Turkish authorities decided that instead of celebrating or commemorating the Gallipoli landings on the 25th of April, when, as you know, the British and New Zealand and Australian armies landed on the Bosphorus coast, instead of that, they moved it forward to the 24th of April in order to smother the commemorations of the Armenian Genocide. I mean, I asked myself, Erdogan must be very frightened if he's prepared to falsify the date of Turkey's greatest military victory in modern history. Incredible. He must be worried. And there he was, on that day in Gallipoli, not with an awful lot of foreign dignitaries, a day when nothing happened. As Ayhan Aktar pointed out on the evening afterwards, he was giving a lecture at his university in Istanbul, and he showed a tremendously, well, I'm afraid it was a very funny documentary which Erdogan's party had produced on Gallipoli. It was acted, of course, and Turkish soldiers would come forward and say, you know, "I am ready to die for my country." And then you'd see them rushing up a hill, and then they'd brandish their rifles. And as Professor Aktar said, they had the wrong uniforms on, and the wrong hats, and the wrong rifles. And somehow that elided with the whole falsification of Gallipoli. If you are going to change the dates of your own country's history to avoid the real history that you don't want to recognize, then something has gone wrong with denialism. You know, that word genocide, one of the reasons why Turkey refuses to acknowledge the use of the word genocide is because they always say genocide didn't exist in 1915. It was invented by Raphael Lemkin, admittedly we all know about the Armenian Genocide, after the Second World War. So what happened in 1915 at Gallipoli? Wasn't that a victory in the First World War? My dad, who was much older than my mum, he fought in the First World War. He was in the Third Battle of the Somme. He didn't call the Armenian Genocide a genocide then, but he didn't call his battles the First World War. He called it the Great War. And it was only after the Second World War that the Brits and everyone else started calling the Great War the First World War. So if you can't use genocide about 1915 because it was invented after the Second World War, how can the Turks claim they fought in the First World War when the phrase First World War didn't exist until Raphael Lemkin was inventing genocide? It's an odd point that even the Turkish newspapers, who very bravely printed their front pages, at least one of them, in the Armenian language on the 25th of April, recording the events on the 24th in Istanbul, didn't spot the obvious point. Genocide exists even if you want to use it about the Roman Empire, for heaven's sakes. It doesn't work like that. I'm going to make a request because tonight I know we have some Turkish guests and I'm delighted they're here. Too often, and I'm going to speak the truth to you tonight, I talk and lecture to Armenian groups in Detroit and Beirut, and I find not only are there no Turks present, but that they haven't been invited. I do ask those Armenians present, whenever you have a lecture on the Armenian Genocide or Holocaust, you must invite Turkish guests to join you. They have a right to listen to the facts of the genocide, just as you have a duty to invite them. I know we have Turks tonight, I'm delighted. I also ask myself, and I've asked this many times and nothing ever comes of it, why Armenians do not follow what the Israelis have done in making a list of the brave Turks, and we know who they are, they're even mentioned in the Bryce report, they include at least one Ottoman governor, who risked their lives to save Armenian lives during the Armenian Holocaust. By the way, my newspaper calls it the Armenian Holocaust with a capital H. And when once we had a sub-editor who made it into a small h, I got a phone call from an Armenian friend of mine in Boston who said, "Oh, we're a small h now, are we, Robert? Didn't the Turks kill quite enough of us to merit a capital H?" Since I passed that on back to the editor, we're back to a capital H for the Armenians again. But seriously, you know, the word Holocaust was not used during the Second World War, but does anyone deny for a moment that that's what the Jewish genocide was? Of course it was a Holocaust, just as the Armenian Holocaust was a Holocaust, in the words of Winston Churchill, whom I'll come to later. But if you were to draw up a list of the righteous Turks who protected the Armenian victims, just as the Israelis have drawn up lists of the righteous Gentiles who protected the Jews before and during the Second World War, could you not present such a list to Erdogan and ask him to sign it and honour the brave Turks who in the darkest moment morally of their history were prepared to maintain the honour of their country? I've asked this now for 20 years, the first time I think in San Francisco, and everyone thinks it's quite a good idea and no one ever does anything about it. There was one man who wrote me a rather angry letter saying I pointed it out. I said we should have such a list. But it was paragraph 20 in a letter of such abuse to the Turkish president that I don't think it really counted. So what do we do to widen the memory of the genocide and seek the ultimate historical victory of Turkey's acknowledgement? Things are changing, as we all know, and as Rafi pointed out. As long ago as 1999, I was reporting the Turkish earthquake. And I went off to a suburb of Istanbul. My plane had just landed. I didn't have a chance at that point to go much further. There were the wrecked buildings. The buildings had fallen down. And a lone man with his daughter, who spoke beautiful English, and who turned out to be Turkey's top expert on earthquakes. And he lamented to me, they wouldn't even pay my taxi fare to come and see what had happened. So, of course, I said, from this moment, you're working for the independent newspaper. And you're working for the Middle East correspondent. And sure enough, he did. For the whole week, I had Turkey's top expert travelling with me around Turkey and looking at a great tragedy. At the end of the week, I took him and his family and friends to a big lunch on the Bosphorus. Buzbag wine, I think he chose, which is red. And at the beginning of the lunch, I said, as I always say to Turkish friends, all right, before we start eating, the Armenian Genocide. Well, they didn't reply quite like that. It wasn't quite like that. There was a sort of moment, and the waiter sort of stood poised with the rictus of fear on his face. But my friend said, look, Robert, we all know it happened. This is 1999, when you didn't say that kind of thing at a public restaurant in Istanbul quite so freely. Now, fast forward to the Istanbul Book Fair a couple of years ago, which I was a bit lazy and didn't want to go to, but my wife suggested that I really should go because my book had been published in Turkey, in perfect Turkish, with my Armenian, this is The Great War for Civilization, my last big book, with a chapter on the Armenian Genocide, which is extremely cruel and brutal in reality, and it had been perfectly translated into Turkish. I got a Turkish-speaking Armenian to check that, of course. And I was, at the last day, I was at the, I had 21 radio and television interviews across Turkey, and only one of them I had a problem, and that was with a director who disagreed with me before the programme began. But on the last day, I was at the Istanbul Book Fair. There was a long queue of people, because on the previous night I'd been on Turkish TRT, state television, talking about the genocide. And this very nice young man came and said, Mr. Fisk, my perfect English, of course, my father saw you on television last night, and he asked me to come along and asked me to get you to sign the book and sign it to him. So I was sitting down there signing the book, you see, going fine. I said, by the way, what does your father do? You see, he said, he's the chief of police of Istanbul. My God, I signed the book. But there's a change. He wouldn't have done that 10 years before, would he? I keep going on about more research. As the victims die, and the last ones, I saw a lady of 101 years old who was a 1918-1919 victim of the Armenian Genocide last year in California. But as the last of the Armenian victims die, I still believe that in the unfound treasures of archives, still unlooked for, and photographs that have not yet been found, the dead still speak to us and can still be alive. Because every time we find a new document, a new file, a new photograph, they're alive again and they're speaking to us. You know, Hake, my old friend in the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan, he's now found a new way of getting hold of Armenian genocide photographs. Not necessarily bodies, Armin Wegener's pictures, not necessarily people in the towns or before the genocide, but pictures taken by Germans and Austrian troops who, of course, were training, quote unquote, the Turkish Fourth Army at the time of the genocide in 1915. Many of them did take pictures. They're little cameras. My dad took a camera for the First World War. These were the high-tech, state-of-the-art YouTubes of their time, the phone camera, if you like. And those who took photographs at the end of the First World War, they were given safe passage back to Berlin or Vienna by the British and French and Americans, of course, who won the First World War. And many of them put these genocide photographs, many of them not showing dead people, but showing the convoys, in albums. Fast forward to 1945, and the Russian army, the Soviet army, arrives in Berlin, looting everything from camels to tramcars and photo albums. And Haig has been to Moscow and found people who've got photographs of the Armenian genocide, which were brought back to Moscow by grandfathers who were in Berlin in 1945, who grabbed the albums from homes of soldiers who, more than a quarter of a century before, had been in Turkey during the genocide. So the photographs went, for example, from Trabzon, Auditorium, Erzurum, up to Berlin and Vienna, then to Moscow, and at last, slowly, trickled, drop by drop, back to Yerevan. This is what I mean by digging and digging and digging. You know, there's one of the things I've been struck with recently is a new book by Stefan Ihrig called Ataturk in the Nazi Imagination. If you haven't read it, you should. You know, there's this phrase that Hitler was always credited with, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians. He said this just before German troops invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. The Turks dispute, like they dispute everything, the Turks dispute that this quotation was real. In fact, Hitler used exactly the same phrase in 2 newspaper interviews long before he was credited by the UPI correspondent in Berlin in 1939 of using it about the Poles. Of course, much of the Polish population at that time was Jewish. What's interesting is that Erik has spent many, many months going through German archives. He found, for example, that Hitler was an avid reader of a novelist called Karl May. And Karl May wrote a number of novels, in one of which, in the voice of a character, a Christian, he makes the following remarks about the 19th century massacres of Armenians. This is a book that Hitler would have read. I am a Christian and hold the commandment, love thy neighbour, as the first among them, and I say that the Turks did the right thing when they beat the Armenians to death. There is no other way for the Turk to protect himself from the Armenian. The Armenian is the worst type in the world. He sells his wife, his young daughter, he steals from his brother. The whole Constantinople population is morally poisoned by the Armenians. This is a book written before the First World War, but read by Hitler afterwards. Then we have Karl May again and Hans Walter Schummel. A Jew dupes 10 Christians, a Yankee tricks 50 Jews, but an Armenian even dupes 100 Yankees. You see how anti-Semitism and the vile language about the Jews, even before as well as after the First World War, was being linked to the Armenians. Here is Hitler himself in 1927, speaking at a party meeting in Munich. It is impossible that a non-Jew would be able in the long run to compete with the Jews in a Jewish area of business. At least for the Aryan, it is impossible. There are peoples who are able to do so, like the Greeks and the Armenians. Sure, these peoples have come so far that they're able to economically even defeat the Jew. You see, again, anti-Semitism and the Armenians are brought together. 1928, Nuremberg, Hitler again. He's talking here of the danger of a higher population growth in Germany of non-Germans. And the phrase is, we will slowly become a nation of Armenians. Here's Hitler in 1929, talking of a racially mixed Germany, which of course he didn't want. A sense for what constitutes national shame slowly gets lost, and if the enemy is also sitting inside such a nation, he was obviously primarily speaking of the Jews, and is working against it, abolishes all national traditions, even a healthy sense for national culture, then one should not be surprised if within a couple of decades a formerly heroic nation sinks down to the level of a wretched Armenian. So the connections between the Armenian genocide and Hitler's Nazism and anti-Semitism and the Second World War are clear ideologically through the history from the late 19th century through to 1939, and yet Israel refuses to accept that the Armenian genocide was a genocide. A historical lesson has been learned by many nations, but not extraordinary enough by Israel itself. We even have another book by a known Nazi, much later in the 30s, a biography of Ataturk, who of course died in 1938, which begins its narrative with the hoarse, excited yelling of the haggling Armenians in Constantinople. And so it goes on. Here's Fritz Rösler, another biographer of Ataturk, talking about the need for the persecution of Christians and the neutralization of life-threatening foreign bodies. His book includes a chapter with the title, Liquidation of the Annoying Armenians. So here is a clear line which links the Armenian genocide and the war crimes of that genocide with the war crimes of the Second World War. Quite apart from the fact that some of the German diplomats and military officers who witnessed the genocide turned up in the Wehrmacht, killing Jews in the Second World War after Hitler's invasion of June 1941. We need more Stefan Eriks in our monumental detective hunt of this story of horror and shame in 1915. As I said, the very last Armenian Holocaust survivors are now almost all dead. And yes, we have recordings, film, tape, but the facts of the Armenian genocide must live on in further research in the archives. Millions of words of human witnesses remain unseen and unheard. Here are a few of them for you. About 50,000 Armenian refugees were flooding down the road. It was an amazing and tragic sight. This is British Army Medical Officer Alan Glenn, who was to write about this years after he saw the survivors of the greatest war crimes of the First World War. There were old men and women and children. Now and then we passed at the roadside a dying person, or one already dead and half eaten by dogs. We could do nothing for them. Craig, his fellow medical officer, told me later that he attended an old refugee in the road who, before he died, gave him a leather belt full of sovereigns, which he asked him to spend to help the refugees. Greater love hath no man. Glenn's memoirs of Gallipoli and Mesopotamia, his manuscript difficult to read on the fading typewritten paper lying among his widow's papers when she died in 1984, were only published by his sons a year ago. Thus we can now read another precious, independently witnessed, albeit tiny fragment of the vilest act of the 1914-18 war. These diaries are still being found and published. Ironically, researchers of the First World War are finding them, but Armenian researchers are missing some of them. I don't know why, but you might ask yourself that question. Of course, we have to come back constantly to the memory that so many people, including, of course, our own dear Tony Blair. If anyone can explain Tony Blair to me, they get $10 at the end of the A man who has such a close relationship with God, you might have thought, God perhaps would have given him some advice, like, don't get involved in Iraq, Tony, but apparently that advice was not said or listened to. From the very first day, Blair colluded at trying to keep the Armenians out of Genocide Day in this country. And, of course, a confidential Foreign Office briefing in 2007, actually compiled by the culprit's name was Michael Attenborough, International Affairs Researcher at the House of Parliament, wrote a document. I'll read you a few bits of it. You'll enjoy this, I'm sure. It has proved extremely difficult. This is the 19th of June 2007. Even in 2007, it has proved extremely difficult to disentangle the truth, and the issues remain the subject of considerable controversy. You know what he's talking about, don't you? Observers are far from unanimous as to whether the Armenian massacres and deaths that occurred during the deportations constitute an official campaign of genocide, as opposed to the unofficial campaigns perpetrated by the Ottoman authorities. And he goes on, the British government's position on the issue, wait for it, has been reiterated on many occasions, you bet it has. Since the Bryce Report of 1915, it's been all downhill. Officially, the British government acknowledges the strength of feeling, it's very generous, about what it describes as a terrible episode of history. I can think of quite a lot of those, some in Syria at the moment, and recognises the massacres of 1915-16 as a tragedy. Like, maybe there was a flood at the time, or an earthquake, or perhaps there was a volcano blew up somewhere over Anatolia. However, neither the current government nor previous British governments, this is a lie, have judged that the evidence is sufficiently unequivocal to persuade it that these events should be categorised as genocide. That's the sort of stuff that backed Tony Blair's original decision, until he was shamed out of it, to cut the Armenians out of Genocide Day. Here's a bit more. This is a highly emotive issue. He's talking about the massacre of 1.5 million Armenians, which provokes strongly held and often polarised views. It sounds like Reuters, doesn't it? Accounts of the period of history in question are by no means clear-cut. I imagine that the mass graves would probably say the same. And as with any such situation, there are differing interpretations. And so it goes on and on and on. We won't go into Mr. Obama's pusillanimous promise before being elected that he would acknowledge it as a genocide, and his continued refusal to do so because he doesn't want to upset the Turks. This sort of thing goes on in journalism. Over and over again you'll find, even on the news agencies, they're beginning to say now, most historians agree that there was a genocide, but the Turkish government hotly disputes this. Now imagine for a moment that such a report was to say, most historians agree that 6 million Jews were killed in the Nazi Holocaust, but right-wing historians hotly dispute this. They would never dream of saying it, nor should they. But the Turks will still get away with this, officially at least. Let me show you how it affects journalism. About 2010 it was, I was in Toronto talking to an Armenian audience. But before I did, I was on CTV, Canadian television, where I was interviewed about the Armenian Genocide. The lady, the interviewer, behind her was a huge picture of Armenian corpses and a few dying Armenians, children mostly. So it was a pretty grim picture. But when she started to question me about it, she had a problem. She couldn't call it genocide. So she referred to it as deadly massacres. is I ask you to think about this for a moment. As opposed to the massacres which are undeadly, where the people get up later and walk away, because it's not really that bad, these were deadly massacres, equals genocide, but you can't say so. Later, when I actually put these frightful words into the lecture, the CTV executives were in the audience, and I got an immediate SMS, beep, beep, this is way out of line. I said, no, it isn't, it's spot on. You were too cowardly to use the word genocide because you're frightened of Turkish Canadian viewers watching your television program. So you see, just as we skivvy away from the truth of the Palestine-Israel tragedy, where we talk about the wall, where we talk about a fence, where we talk about Palestinians killed in clashes. They were killed by clashes, you see, not by Israelis, and so on and so forth. So we play the same almost denialist game with the Turks. But let me go on with a few more largely unpublished memories of those who knew the Armenian genocide was real. Here is Sam Kadorian from Harput, only 7 or 8 when his family was sent on the death march. Sometime later, Turkish gendarmes came over and grabbed all the boys from 5 to 10 years old. They grabbed me too. They threw us all into a pile on the sandy beach and started jabbing at us with their swords and bayonets. I must have been in the centre because only one sword got me, nipped my cheek, here, my cheek. When it was getting dark, my grandmother found me. It hurt so much, I was crying, and she put me on her shoulder and walked around. Then some of the other parents came looking for their children. They mostly found dead bodies. Does this sound like ISIS to you, perhaps? Yeah. The riverbank there was very sandy. Some of them dug graves with their bare hands, shallow graves, and tried to bury their children in them. Others just pushed them into the river. They pushed them into the Euphrates. Their little bodies floated away. And here is Astrid Agajanian, who died in England only a few months ago, talking to me in the final year of her life. At a village one night, my father, who had been deported with us, came to see us. He told my mother that he thought he was being allowed to say goodbye, that he would be shot with the other men. I remember my mother told me that my father's last words were, the only way to remember me is to look after Astrid. We never saw him again. It was a long march, and the Turks and Kurds came to carry off girls for rape. My other grandmother died along the way. So did my newly born brother, Vatkes. We had to leave him by the roadside. One day, the Turks said they wanted to collect all the young children and look after them. Some women who couldn't feed their children let them go. Then my mother saw them piling the children on top of each other and setting them on fire. My mother pushed me under another pile of corpses. My mother saved me from the fire. She used to tell me afterwards that when she heard the screams of the children and saw the flames, it was their souls going up to heaven. Here is the Iranian writer Mohammad Jamalzadeh. I found this in a Persian scripted book, traveling from Aleppo to Istanbul in 1915. Right at the beginning of our journey, we witnessed unbelievably and unspeakably shocking and extraordinary scenes. We saw numerous groups of Armenians who were being escorted by armed mounted Turkish soldiers, being driven to their death towards annihilation. At first it was very shocking to us. However, later it became so common that we would not look at them. Hundreds of Armenian women and men, along with their children, in a miserable condition, were being driven along on foot under the blows of whips and guns, whipping them along like flocks of sheep. Austrian architect and engineer Litzmeier, we do not know his first name, but he was working for the German government on the Baghdad Railway, saw a large army moving towards him north of Ras Al Ain in 1915. He thought it was a Turkish army heading for Mesopotamia, Iraq. In the words of Armenian priest Grigoris Balakian, ancestor, of course, of your Armenian historian Peter Balakian, as the crowd came closer, however, Litzmeier realized that it was not an army, but a huge caravan of women moving forward under the supervision of soldiers. They numbered as many as 40,000. They had known hopelessness and physical hardship, starvation, filth, abduction by Kurdish and Circassian mobs, pillage and so on. They were mere skeletons enveloped in rags, with skin that had turned leathery, burned from the sun, cold and wind. When these wretched men met the Austrian engineer, they surrounded him and begged him to give them each a piece of bread. Litzmeier made every effort. When Sarah Aronson arrived in Palestine by rail from Turkey in December 1915, she was in a state of shock. Her brother was to describe how She saw the bodies of hundreds of Armenian men, women and children lying on both sides of the railway. Dogs were observed feeding on the bodies. There were hundreds of bleached skeletons. Sarah's train, according to historian Scott Anderson, was besieged by thousands of starving Armenians. In the stampede, dozens fell beneath the wheels of the train, much to the delight of its conductor. Because she expressed her horror at the scene, Sarah, who came from the Ottoman Palestine and was Jewish, was condemned by Turkish officers on the train for her lack of patriotism. Winston Churchill was the first to call the Armenian Genocide a Holocaust in a book in the 1930s, which I inherited from my dad. In fact, he called it an administrative Holocaust. He used a small h, thus emphasizing its organized and industrial nature. And many hundreds of thousands of Israelis, unlike their pusillanimous government, today do acknowledge the Armenian Genocide. Those of you who have been to Israel will know that when Israelis refer in Hebrew to the genocide, they call it the Shoah of the Armenians. They use the word Holocaust in Hebrew. There is no reasonable doubt that this crime was planned and executed for political reasons. The atrocities, Churchill himself was to write, stirred the ire of simple and chivalrous men and women spread widely about the English-speaking world. Not for long, of course. Now I'm going to quote an article I wrote in The Independent in April of 2014, a year before we went to Istanbul. When Turkey commemorates the 1915 battles at Gallipoli next year, I meant of course 2015, along with the British, Australians, New Zealanders and French, it will use these celebrations to try to smother the memory of the Gorgon crime which it carried out against the Armenians in the First World War. A people killing that began at almost the hour of the first Anzac landings. Guests from Britain and Australia, New Zealand and France will not mention the fate of the Armenians, which began the day after their own soldiers stormed ashore at Gallipoli the day before. On the Somme, more than 1 million men were killed or wounded. They were all soldiers. But 1.5 million civilians were killed in Armenia's Somme. And we, our representatives, our diplomats, I wrote this in 2014, will ignore those Armenians when we meet the Turkish genocide deniers at Gallipoli next year. And thus, so say the Armenians, we will help to kill the dead of their First World War Holocaust all over again. And we did just that. Prince Charles did just that. He sat next to President Erdogan in Gallipoli on the 24th of April. He did not walk with the Armenians in Istanbul on the 24th of April. Funny how letters keep coming even to journalists who write about the Armenian Genocide. This letter came from a Christian lady whose grandparents were Czech Christians, but whose grandmother found herself mistaken for an Armenian. Here is a letter she wrote me in 2013. I called her this evening to get the names of her grandparents. His name was Joseph Miller. He was originally Müller in German. He was actually a Sudeten Czech. And Lois Lavaskova was his wife, the grandmother of the lady who wrote me this letter, Patricia Brooks. And she said that reading further proof of Turkey's genocide rang bells with me. My grandparents left Czechoslovakia and went east to Baghdad, Aleppo, Beirut, Alexandria, Cairo, etc. They were musicians. In 1915, Papa, my grandfather, was called up to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army. And while he was away, my grandmother lived in either Aleppo or Beirut. It was learned that the Turks were coming, massacring Christians. She means Armenians, of course. And my grandmother's neighbour, a Jewish lady, rushed round to her and gave her a Star of David to wear. When the knock on the door came, my grandmother opened it and brandished the star around her neck. She wasn't touched. So even by writing about the Armenians, dark news stories come out of the Christians who lived and almost died, who were not Armenians in the Middle East. I want to talk now again about pictures. My old friend Hake in Yerevan taught me a lot about this. And I want to show you a series of pictures that were taken by a young Austrian soldier in the Austro-Hungarian army, of course allied with the Ottoman Empire and with Germany and helping to train the Turkish army. In 1915, he was based at an Austrian military post south of Erzurum. As many of the Armenians here will know, no one survived the convoys south of Erzurum. And one day, he obviously heard or saw tens of thousands of people moving past his military post. And when he emerged with his little box camera, probably similar to the one my dad had in the First World War, he started taking pictures. I'm going to show you the first picture he took now, if you can go ahead with the photo. You can see here, this is, I think, about 40 miles south of Erzurum. These are the Armenians on the death convoy. We know that none of these Armenians will survive. You can see they've still got mules, horses, some of them. I think there's a camel further down. Still got clothes on. Hills, rather beautiful hills in the background. It's a breezy day because when you run forward, backwards and forwards between these three pictures, I'm going to show you, the tree moves, so there's a breeze blowing. Did these Armenians know they were going to die? Can we have the second picture? They're coming closer to us. Now they're almost here with us in the lecture theatre. You can see that there are women walking, men with sticks, some children riding on top of a mule. But look on the right of the picture. When you blow that up, the further object appears to be a shoe. People are losing their shoes. Look at the roadway itself. You can see the tracks of all the carts that have come before. These people knew something terrible was happening. What did they know? Now let's bring them right into the lecture theatre with the third picture, Vi. Now they're passing us. You see, they still have old farm wagons to travel on. There's several people on top of the wagons. Look, you can see what appear to be shoes on the right, more of them now, and particularly the tracks of other vehicles, one of which has come off the road. They must have known something terrible was happening. Now I have one more picture. He moved aside from here. These appear to be pictures taken behind him as the same people passed away from him. A woman on a wagon, a child, still dressed, still clothed. They've still got some family belongings, a bedspread of some kind that the woman is sitting beside. Her face is not exactly one of confidence. And now the last picture of the series. I don't know where this was taken, but you can still see they still have their animals, probably the same range of hills. But there's a man with a bandage around his face, and I think they knew what was going to happen. I show you these pictures. How many people here have seen these photographs before? 2, 3, 4. You see, I think it's by going to photographs and digging into the archives like this that you're able to see the reality. Not of dead bodies. There are plenty of Wegener's pictures of dead Armenians, and there are plenty of photographs of the original deportation with Turkish gendarmerie. But this is the day of doom for these people, and there they are, not knowing the future. And I find these 5 photographs among the most moving I've seen of the Armenian genocide, because they don't know, or do they? And that is the value, I think, of showing photographic evidence of what happened in 1915. There must be thousands more photographs like this, which we have never seen. I don't know if we ever will. So the more research is done, the more we will see them. The Moscow connection. Good old Haik Demoyan of the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan. You know, just over 30 years ago, I dug the bones of Armenians, of the genocide victims, out of a hillside above the Habur River in Syria. I had an Armenian family with me, and we originally trying to look for a place on the Habur River where we knew there were bones in 1919, when families were looking for skeletons. But then when we got to the top of a hill, we saw an old riverbed and realized that so many Armenians had been killed there that the river had changed its course, and the actual Habur River was behind another hill. But it had been raining, and the rain had washed away a small valley through the hill that we were standing on. And as we walked down the crevasse, we looked up and saw the wall was made of skulls and bones. These were the killing fields. We actually had a Syrian government official watching us. So I said, no, it's all right, it's not your responsibility. This was a bit earlier than the Assad regime. Nonetheless, we took the bones, a few of them. I used my car key to dig several of the bones and some of the skulls out. We took them to the Armenian Holocaust Memorial Church, or Genocide Memorial Church in Deir ez-Zor, where, in the last few months, the Nusra Front, now portraying themselves as the new moderates of the Middle East, because they'd like some American weapons, please, destroyed the Armenian church and threw all the bones of the genocide victims that were buried in the crypt, including presumably the ones I found, into the street. I find an awful lot of parallels, you know, now, as my wife and I travel around Syria and learn of what ISIS is doing and of what the Syrian regime is doing. Because, you know, oddly enough, back in the period of the genocide of 1915, there was a great precise accountability about the Turks. The telegrams that went from Talat to Enver Pasha were quite specific about where Armenians would be sent, and you know what to do with them when they arrive. I don't want to hear any more about it. In other words, it was quite specifically planned. The Turkish gendarmerie didn't just turn up with 10 men or 20. They knew how many were to be at particular locations to take these people onto the death marches into the desert. Across the area north of Deir ez-Zor now, there are human bones lying in the fields, and they're just turned over when the farmers plough. Now, of course, it's ISIS country. I was much struck by this question of precision when I was talking to an Armenian priest from a town, Armenian town, which had been briefly captured in Syria, where he said, I went back to my library and they had burned every book, and there was a foot of ashes on the floor. That was my library, he said to me. And I'm very struck by this when I went into the partly Christian town of Yabrud. I went there again with my wife in the last week. But when it was originally taken by the Syrian army from the Nusra Front in February of last year, I went in with them. And I went to the Christian church there, Orthodox, not Armenian, which was actually is the oldest church in Syria. It still has Roman columns in the apse. And the Nusra Front people had come round with drills and drilled out the eyes of all the saints in the mosaics round the church. There was even a mosaic of St. George and the Dragon. And they drilled out St. George's eyes. And they even drilled out the dragon's eyes. What has ISIS and Nusra got against dragons, I asked myself. But inside the church, there were magnificent oil paintings of the saints, and all of them had been slashed like this. And I grabbed, the place hadn't been demined by then, but I grabbed one of those strips from the floor. Here it is. This is from the Syrian front line in the Syrian war. You can see the saint's eyes there. It took me several days before it struck me what was important about this. Any of you want to give a guess what's important about this? Have a look at it carefully. It's not the picture. Yeah, it's precise. Somebody used a machine to cut this. The precision, this was not someone stabbing ideologically madly at a painting with a knife. Someone cut this deliberately into strips. They were all of the same shape and size. Somebody got a machine to scissor up all the paintings. It's this precision quality. Look at those terrible videotapes where you have 7 camera angles to film the burning to death of a Jordanian pilot. There's a precision behind this which is quite frightening, which I suspect existed in the great anti-Christian pogrom of 1915, which is what it was, because it did include the Greeks as well, much worse so in Smyrna, now Izmir, of course. How then, and I'll finish now, how then to make the world realize, along with research, of the necessity of acknowledging the crimes against humanity that happened in 1915. I've had a lot of debates with Jewish historians and activists who are constantly searching for ways of how to memorialize the Holocaust, of the Nazi Holocaust, after the last survivors are dead. And I think that one of the things that struck me in all the arguments I've had, and some of them in letters from Jewish readers of The Independent or my articles, is that when I've said, look, the Jewish people, like the Armenian people, I think you've got to concentrate for the future memory of what happened on the fact that the victims were human beings just like me. Immediately I said that, and I wrote it in the paper. A Jewish reader said, no, they were killed because they were Jews and because we were sought after to be victimized. And it's all true. That is the reason, just as the Armenians were sought after because they were Armenians. But I think that the reason why my mother gave me the Diary of Anne Frank to read as the first book to read on my own as a little boy was because she realized that I would regard this little girl as a sister or a mother, just like me. And I think that the way for the Armenians, as well as the research and the new photographs, to continue on with the memory after the last memories have died in the brains of those who lived, is to constantly remind the world that the Armenians were human beings just like us. They were the same. That is why it is a war crime. It can be anti-Semitic crime, it can be a sectarian crime, but a crime against humanity means the word humanity. not this group of people or that group of people. So I guess I'm going to finish with one of the most moving interviews I ever did with an Armenian genocide survivor. My wife has film of this interview. The man was talking like so many Armenian genocide survivors in the Turkish language. He didn't speak Armenian, and he was in the old people's home in Beirut. Long dead now. This was his story as he told it to us. We lived in Dortyol. My father was called Sarkis and my mother was Mariam. There were 10 children, including me and my brothers and sisters. The Turks collected all the people with their donkeys and horses. We were to go to Aleppo and Ras Al Ain, that same name again. But they started killing us on the way. The Turks forced us to the Habur River, here we go, and by the time we got there was only my mother and my sister and me left. They told the women and the men to take off all their clothes. My sister was 18 and a man on a horse came and grabbed her and put her on his horse. He did this in front of us. It happened in front of my eyes. I was not blind then. And they started to beat my mother. When we arrived to talk to him, he was reading the Bible in Braille. As she begged them not to take my sister, the Turks beat my mother to death. I have always remembered that as she died, she screamed my name, Harutiun, Harutiun. Later, an Arab Bedouin took me to his house and I stayed there for 3 years. The war was over, and then people came saying they were looking for Armenian orphans. I said I was Armenian, so they took me to Aleppo. There I caught a virus that affected my eyes. I was suddenly blind, and I was only 11 years old. Then he says, until I was 23, I was filled with rage because the Turks took my sister and beat my mother in front of my eyes until she died. But when I was 23, I felt this was not the right way to be a man. So I began to pray to God so he would see me. I was making peace with myself. Now I'm ready to meet my God. I'm at peace. Last year, when the big earthquake happened in Turkey, it killed so many Turks. And I prayed to God for those Turks. I prayed for those poor Turkish people. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
I almost don't want to stop clapping.
I want you to.
Wow. Emotive, insightful, engaging.
I told you it was my public relations.
Deeply thank you, Dr.
You're
Roberts.
welcome.
Thank you. This is all about dialogue. It's not just one way. It's engaging with all of us. So for those in the audience now who have questions, statements, it's your time now. But I'm going to abuse my power as the chair and ask the first one. And say that yesterday we witnessed something in Turkey, the elections. And we saw that past the threshold of 10%. They're in government now. But who are the headed there? They represent the Kurds, the minorities, the homosexuals, women, equality. They say in Turkish, freedom, all these different slogans flying around. So why is it important they're there? I feel that sort of ties in with what Dr. Robert Fisk was saying. And he said we must honour those Turks and Kurds who did rescue Armenians. And so my question, firstly, is how do we utilise this? In Turkey itself, where all this change is happening, where the change must fundamentally happen, how do Armenians, Turks and Kurds utilise this?
Look, I think that the Turkish government one day will officially acknowledge that it was a genocide and that their ancestors, not the same actual government of course, but their ancestors, committed these crimes against humanity. The Kurds have been saying as much for 20 years now. And in parts, for example, of Anatolia, there are Turks who have discovered that they are partly Armenian, who've actually learned the Armenian language and are talking to the Kurds about what happened and what their grandfathers did. There is an example the Turks could follow. I'm always amazed at Turkey, which is such a brave country. I mean, during the Korean War, Turkish troops were the only soldiers of the United Nations force in Korea which were not brainwashed. They stood up against the North Korean communist and Chinese authorities. So why can't they acknowledge a genocide that happened now 100 years ago? Incredible. I think the real problem here, and the one which we're not really acknowledging, is that Turkey knows especially if it gets membership of the EU, which I think it should when it acknowledges the truth of the Armenian genocide, that there's going to be a compensation question. I'm sure the Americans will pay all the money for them, but the fact of the matter is that there will be a compensation question. After all, if it's a European Union country, not only can Armenians living in, say, Paris go and demand compensation, they can also ask to go and live in their homes, which is not quite an idea that will commend itself to Mr. Erdogan and his friends, perhaps not even to the Kurds, but that may happen. But I think that history, as I say, it works through developments, not by clocks and anniversaries. But I think the compensation question is very serious. However, I think it's also that the continuation of denialism is, you cannot get away from this, partly the responsibility of the United States. Just as America will not stand up to Israel over the continued building of colonies, for which we read settlements from the press, on stolen Arab land, so it will not stand up to the Turkish military or the Turkish government over the question of the genocide. It amazes me, whenever countries actually do acknowledge it, nothing happens. The Turks say, we will break off military relations, we'll withdraw our ambassador. Sometimes they do, and then the ambassador creeps back and everything carries on as usual. Air France actually carried an advertisement for an exhibition in Avignon on the Armenian Genocide a few years ago, and there it was in the magazine on every Air France plane flying to Istanbul, and nothing happened, presumably because the Turks like flying Air France until Turkish Airlines improved, which it has. But the point I'm making is that, all these panacea ideas, use them, go for them, say yes it happened. And I don't think anything. If the British government, which Cameron will of course follow the Blair line, if the British government said it was a genocide and it's time the Turks admitted it, I don't think it'll affect NATO. I don't think British exports to Turkey will suffer. I think the Israelis could do the same. If you stand up to people who make threats, they'll cave in and give way and say yes it was true. And already Turks are saying that. The only thing I would say is that I think that it's a bit like people who want to boycott organizations, institutions in Israel. First of all, I'm not sure it works. But secondly, you must make sure that you're not going to boycott the goodwill of those Turks who want to acknowledge the genocide. And there are many, and they're growing. I hardly meet now an educated Turkish man or woman who doesn't acknowledge in some form that it was a genocide, that it wasn't the deaths of two groups of people in the chaos of war and so on and so forth. But it's a pity that Armenia itself, little rump Armenia, is not such a corrupt nation. I've been there a few times. I'm not deeply impressed by Armenian democracy, and nor, given the number of people nodding their heads, I
just want to thank Mr. Fisk for his presentation and to thank him for always standing up and speaking the truth. But my question is in regards to the parallels I want to bring from the history. When the young Turks came to power, they promised Armenians to give more rights, which the Armenians were hoping for positive change.
Yeah, they went along with it.
And they believed that young Turks will bring change and give them more rights. And now I want to bring the parallels. Now we're seeing some changes in the present government, and we're hoping that something is going to change. But how can we keep this trust? How can we believe that the same thing will not happen again, which happened?
Well, there's one critical difference. There's not very many Armenians left in Turkey to persecute if they're lying.
Yes, but Turkey continues its policy
of saying one thing and doing the other? I don't see why they'd want to do that now. I mean, they're not trying to cleanse their nation anymore. They pretty much did that in 1915, didn't they, in their own language. I don't see, if the Turks come forward and say the genocide happened, I think that's the end. I mean, I don't think it's the end of historical research. I mean, it's the end of the argument about demanding acknowledgement. Once people say, we're sorry, we did it, that pretty much closes down the argument for a while. After that, it's digging through the research to find out who did what and when. And then you can have Turkish and Armenian historians working together. But you can't have Turkish and Armenian historians working to find out if it was a genocide, which is the Turkish line. It was. Can you imagine turning to the Jews of Europe and saying, well, not sure it was a Holocaust, but we're going to get some German historians and some Jewish historians to decide if it was. I mean, the world will go mad with anger, rightly so, if that was suggested.
And I'd just like to repeat the question that Zephyr was just asking. You see, there's a very good parallel between what happened in 1908 when the Young Turks came to power. The Armenians had a great part in this movement, that essentially in those days people thought it was going to bring equality, friendship, the French slogans of the French Revolution. But only 3 or 4 years later, we had the Armenian Genocide, which obviously the Young Turks were secretly planning. Now, today's Turkey, and I'm not being cynical, obviously there are some elements of progress in there, but let's not forget that the same Turkey is giving the full logistical and all the other support to ISIS and all the destructive forces that are doing creating havoc. But I haven't finished. The same Turkey, you see, Mr. Fisk, I really enjoy your talk, but I'm afraid, and I hope you take this as a positive criticism, you occasionally contradict yourself. The problem, the big elephant in the room, is the industry of denialism, which is still continuing, and it's export to the whole world. Now, let's not forget, just 2 or 3 months ago in Switzerland, Pirenchek, who was a convicted criminal in the Ergenekon case, was financed by the Turkish government to go and defend himself. Now, this is the same Turkish government with all the progress, with all the starry-eyed things that we're talking about, progress in Turkey. And please, we should not confuse, as I'm afraid you often do, the Turks, this Turks, etc., with the Turkish government. We have no problem. I have a lot of great friends in the Turkish human rights movement, Mr. Zarakulu and all the other journalists you talk about. But the problem is the Turkish state, which is the same as the Nazi state, and which is still continuing. So,
no, I think I've got the question, but I think because other people have got questions to ask, I'm going to try and answer you a bit now. You're quite right, the problem is Turkish nationalism. And the German Nazis spotted that in their deceptive and horrible way when they began to associate Turkish, cleansing of the nation with their own ideas of destroying the Jews of Germany and then of the rest of Europe. I think one of the problems which we're not addressing actually, which I haven't and should have mentioned, is that by acknowledging the genocide, they're not accusing Ataturk of involvement in that, because he wasn't. But many of the generals in Turkey which supported Ataturk were culpable of crimes against humanity against the Armenians, and thus the Ataturk regime from the start was stained, and that is one problem. But you can go further than that. By the way, the phrase "the Turks," look, it's journalism. If I say the Brits went to war in Afghanistan, most Brits didn't and were against it, but the Brits means the British government, the British army, you name it. So when I say the Turks, do I mean the Ottoman Turks? Yes. Do I mean the Turkish people today? No. Everybody who committed crimes in 1915 is dead, like most of the victims are now. So, you've got to have a certain laxity of the use of words here in order to get across what you're trying to say. But no, I think that deep down, Erdogan still does not have the slightest intention of acknowledging the genocide. He's gone a certain amount of the way with the Kurds, of course, the Circassians, in a speech down in Diyarbakir about 18 months ago, but he hasn't got as far as the Armenians, and it's going to be a long time to go. What I am saying is that academic institutions are beginning to bend. One academic institution tried to stop the holding of the seminar on the Armenian Genocide that Akhtar arranged, which we attended in Istanbul, but it was held. And when the Armenians and Turks marched through the streets of Istanbul and crossed the Bosphorus in the boat, there were riot police to make sure no one touched them. And the people at Taksim Square in the evening, whom the Turks were worried about, were not Turkish people, but the people referred to by a Turkish friend of ours as the Azeri bastards who want to kill the Armenians. So there's an Azerbaijan element, there's a Nagorno-Karabakh element, which we don't have time to go into this evening. It is, I grant you, more complex, but also much wider than that. But I take your point. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, more questions. I have one down here, and a lady up there. I'll take your one first, please.
Can you speak up for everybody here? No, not stand up, just speak up.
I'd like to say you're wrong, because Ataturk did order his troops to eliminate the Armenians, and I do have proof.
Oh, good. Can I have it? Sorry. The proof. I want the proof of it for me to write about it. Yeah.
My friend is not here right now.
Right.
He's ethnically half Laz, and his grandfather was part of his campaign. And at some point, he was linked with the Young Turk movement. You see.
Yeah, but that does not mean that Ataturk was personally stained with blood. That's the point I'm making.
No, but he did have the intentions of eliminating the Armenians, but not just them, also the Greeks or anyone else that opposed him.
Look, he was the cavalry commander in Smyrna, where the Armenians were again butchered with the Greeks. We know
yes,
that.
But he also
he was there.
He also persecuted Circassians as well. Those
That's true, yes, that's
those who
correct.
refused to be part of him or agreed on whatever he wants people to agree with.
Yeah.
I mean, this man here, he burned down many Circassian villages and forced them to have Turkish names. Right? I'm sorry to say this, but that man is a bastard. And
Well, you don't have to be sorry to say it. All I am saying is that in terms of comparing it to Talat Pasha, for example, and Enver Pasha, I don't think Ataturk is on the same scale. And I think that, you know, you've got to recognise that for Turks, he was the victor of Gallipoli. He whipped the Brits, as we all have to realise. But, you know, if you have documentation specifically linking him to the Armenian genocide, then give it to me, I'll write about it. But just calling him a bastard is not academic enough for me. There's the lady up there.
in the white collar.
Dr. Fisk, it's such an honor to speak to you. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, it's a hypothetical thing. The lands we are disputing, and hypothetically, we may get a bit back if we get...
You want some of Armenia back?
Yes.
Good luck.
Hypothetically. Those are the same lands Kurds are also disputing or battling for. So, decades down the line, a century down the line, we may find ourselves opposite the Kurds, trying to fighting for the same lands. I mean, I'm throwing this at you to see what you have to say on it.
My crystal ball broke many, many decades ago in the Middle East, you know. Look, the tragedy of the Armenian state, apart from the fact that it's corrupt at the moment, is it doesn't have a seaboard on the Mediterranean. Because basically, we wiped out the American mandate for Armenia after the First World War. I mean, basically, Sèvres, Lausanne, etc. Much to the delight of Mr. Ataturk, of course. I think that, you know, the Kurds have an extraordinary ability to destroy themselves on a regular basis. But when I was in northern Iraq at the end of the 1991 War of Liberation, it was very striking how the Kurds and Armenians fled together, most of them, into the mountains. Some Armenians stayed behind. They thought as Christians they'd be safe under Saddam. But they fled together, and in various homes of Kurds, I met Armenians visiting, and they were talking about the genocide. They were way in front of international dialogue and historians and so on, and they all acknowledged what had happened, that the Kurds had murdered so many of the Armenians. And I think that the Kurdish-Armenian quarrel, so-called, is probably a dead one. I think the Kurds are much more interested in Turkey, but the Armenians are much more interested in Nagorno-Karabakh now. I'm talking about Yerevan, and of course Azerbaijan. That is the kernel of the dispute if you're in Yerevan, not if you're a diaspora Armenian. I mean, one of the things I asked 5 years ago in Yerevan to the foreign minister of Armenia, but doesn't the genocide mean anything to you? He said, I don't think of it from one fortnight to the next. No wonder Mrs. Clinton thought she could get the Prime Minister of Yerevan to sign up to the Turkish agreement of opening the border, you see. I don't think the Kurds are the problem for the Armenians.
Thank you. We'll have time for 2 last questions. There's someone at the very back that I've had my hand up for quite a while, so I'll ask you first. I apologize for the ladies in the room.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fisk, for a fascinating and complex lecture. I've just come back from Eastern Turkey, and one of the things that struck me...
She means Western Armenia.
I just visited Erzurum, Kars and Van, and partly with a view to visiting Armenian churches, which was difficult. So the eerie silence, some of the worst crimes in human history have happened here, and there was no acknowledgement of it. And then I went to the local museum in Erzurum, and there I found a hall that was sort of headed Memories of the Massacre Hall, or something like that. And I thought, this is interesting. There's been a very small exhibit of Armenian artifacts, a couple of church doors, and largely uncommented. And then I saw quite a detailed exhibition But it actually twisted the story and said, yeah, okay, mass graves were found with a lot of very detailed text, but it turned the story around and basically accused the Armenians.
It's the same in Izmir now, which was the same museum there.
Yeah.
If you go to the military museum in Istanbul, as my wife and I did a few weeks ago, there's an Armenian question room.
Yes.
And in it you can see Talat Pasha's blood-stained shirt after he was killed by an Armenian terrorist in Berlin. By the way, Pasha, many Armenians don't seem to realize this, Hitler, in an attempt to get the Turks again to join the Axis powers in World War II, sent Talat Pasha's corpse back to Turkey during the Second World War via Bulgaria on a steam train which carried the swastika on the front and Talat Pasha's coffin in the carriage behind. That's why it's now buried back in Istanbul again.
Yeah.
Sorry, no, you're quite right.
I was just going to ask you to comment on that.
It's not just where you were in Erzurum. It's the case in Diyarbakir, it's the case particularly in Izmir, Smyrna, which of course we're talking 1922 now, which was both the Greeks as well as the and Circassians, but particularly the Armenians again. Yeah, it is a commonplace to see that. And it was very interesting that when the big Turkish government exhibition on the Ottoman Empire, art and culture, took place at the Royal Academy in London 3 years ago, I think, 4 years, there wasn't a single scrap of Armenian art on display, although the Ottoman Empire boasted of its Armenian population for hundreds of years, didn't it? No, there's nothing new in what you saw, but I mean, it's interesting.
No, just slightly.
My wife believes this firmly, and she's persuaded me it's true, and I'm sure it is. Turkey is now taking on the role that Pakistan played for the Americans in funneling weapons to the Afghans, and now Turkey is doing it for the Americans and handing over the weapons to the Free Syrian Army that doesn't really exist anymore, Nusra, ISIS, you name it. And Turkey is going to end up totally corrupted in the way that Pakistan has ended up, courtesy of being gun runners and probably drug runners and money-making mafias. That is a major problem for Turkey. Way in front of any election that Erdogan wins, even if the Kurds get more than 10% of the vote. Syria, right. The Syrian army is the only working institution to defend the state of Bashar al-Assad. It's still a fighting machine, but it is outnumbered and outgunned by its enemies. I've been at Syrian army positions, both this trip and back just before Christmas, where they lug in sackfuls of bits of weapons fired at them, and most of them are bits of missiles made in the United States, either captured in Iraq or handed by the Turks to ISIS or Nusra, you name it. It's quite clear that NATO wants to destroy the Syrian state. It isn't managing it yet. It's amazing that Palmyra, for example, was attacked on a 70-mile front by thousands of ISIS members, but America, with all its satellites, didn't spot them if it's trying to destroy ISIS and blow them all up. Instead, they captured Palmyra, another great victory for democracy in the Middle East. Syria is going through its greatest, I'm talking about the state at the moment. After all, there isn't another state, it's called the Caliphate, there's no border. The Syrian state of Bashar al-Assad is going through its greatest trials at the moment. Everything is changing. But the army has not collapsing, as people will claim. The army, I spent a lot of time with generals and captains. I was on front lines in Kalamu and just below Jisr al-Shagur, and I was 28 miles from Palmyra in the desert. And it was not an army that's collapsing and retreating, although I suspect it's going to go and retreating in areas like Hasaki, south of Qamishli and so on. But the question, that's one reason why they need the Iranians, that's one reason why they need Hezbollah. 46,000 to 60,000, you name the number of military dead in Syria. How do you get those men back? You take them at 14 years old out of school? You can't. So very grave events are happening, but I'm not one of those who believes that Bashar al-Assad is about to depart. If that's perhaps in the background of your mind, I don't know. It doesn't mean that I am particularly fond of the regime. I'm just telling you, as a reporter, what I see.